The engine started by itself 3 hours after being shut down. That was the first sign that Flight 774's final journey wasn't over, even as flames consumed what remained of its twisted fuselage in the aircraft graveyard outside Memphis International Airport. Senior aviation disposal technician Marcus Chen had been overseeing aircraft cremations for 18 years, but nothing had prepared him for what he witnessed that October evening. Chen was responsible for the systematic destruction of decommissioned commercial aircraft, a process that typically involved draining all fluids, removing hazardous materials, and then subjecting the aluminum shell to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Before we go deeper, make sure to subscribe now. This channel exposes aviation mysteries and forbidden reports the industry tries to hide. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next investigation. Flight 774 had arrived at the disposal facility 6 months after its emergency landing in Denver, where all 143 passengers and crew had evacuated safely following what investigators classified as catastrophic engine failure. The aircraft had sat in legal limbo for months while insurance companies battled over liability, but eventually found its way to Chen's facility for final destruction. The cremation process began at 4:15 in the afternoon on October 13th. Chen's team had spent the previous week preparing the Boeing 737, stripping out seats, overhead bins, and any salvageable components. What remained was essentially an empty aluminum tube, ready for incineration. The industrial furnaces roared to life, their blue flames licking at the aircraft's belly as temperatures climbed steadily toward the cremation threshold. Chen had performed this ritual hundreds of times. The process was methodical, almost meditative. First came the smell of burning paint and sealants, followed by the acrid smoke of melting plastic components. The aluminum skin would begin to buckle and warp as the heat penetrated deeper into the structure. Within 6 hours, nothing would remain but molten metal and ash. But at 7:23 that evening, something impossible happened. As Chen monitored the cremation from his observation booth, he noticed movement through the flames. At first, he assumed it was thermal distortion, the way heat waves can create optical illusions on hot pavement. But as he adjusted his protective eyewear and leaned closer to the reinforced glass, the movement became unmistakable. Silhouettes were shifting inside the burning fuselage, human-shaped shadows moving with deliberate purpose through the inferno. Chen's hand trembled as he reached for his radio. His voice cracked as he called his supervisor, veteran disposal manager Rita Kowalski, who had been handling aircraft destruction for over 2 decades. When she arrived at the observation booth 3 minutes later, both technicians watched in stunned silence as the shadows continued their ghostly procession through the flames. The figures appeared to be walking down the center aisle of the aircraft, exactly as passengers would during normal boarding procedures. Some shadows paused, as if adjusting overhead luggage or settling into seats that no longer existed. Others moved toward what would have been the emergency exits, their movements calm and methodical, despite the raging fire consuming everything around them. Kowalski immediately ordered the cremation stopped, but the furnaces couldn't be shut down instantly. The massive heating elements required a gradual cooling process to prevent structural damage to the facility. As the flames continued to burn, more shadows emerged. Chen counted at least 30 distinct figures moving through different sections of the aircraft, some gathering near the wing exits, others congregating in the forward cabin area. The temperature readings showed the interior of the fuselage had reached over 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to instantly vaporize human flesh and bone. No living organism could survive such extreme heat, yet the shadows moved with the fluid grace of the living, not the erratic flicker of flames or burning debris. At 8:41, the shadows began to move in unison toward the rear of the aircraft. Chen watched through his binoculars as they formed what appeared to be an orderly queue, exactly like passengers preparing for evacuation. The last shadow in line turned toward the observation booth, and for a moment that would haunt Chen for the rest of his life, he swore he could see a face through the flames. A woman's face, mouth open as if screaming, but no sound penetrated the roar of the furnaces. That's when Chen collapsed. Security footage later showed the technician falling backward from his chair, his body convulsing as if experiencing a seizure. Kowalski immediately called for medical assistance while continuing to monitor the cremation. By the time paramedics arrived 12 minutes later, the shadows had vanished, but the mysteries were just beginning. When Chen regained consciousness at Methodist Hospital 2 hours later, his first words were a desperate plea for someone to check the passenger manifest for Flight 774. He insisted that the shadows he'd seen matched the exact number of souls who had been aboard the aircraft during its final flight. Hospital staff dismissed his claims as hallucinations brought on by smoke inhalation and trauma, but Kowalski secretly obtained a copy of the manifest. 143 people had been on board Flight 774 during its emergency landing in Denver. Chen had counted exactly 143 shadows moving through the burning fuselage. The cremation resumed the following morning with a new crew, but the strangeness didn't end with Chen's collapse. Technician David Rodriguez, who had worked aircraft disposal for 12 years, reported that the furnaces required 40% more fuel than normal to complete the destruction of 774. The aluminum seemed to resist melting, as if something was protecting it from the inside. What should have been a routine 6-hour cremation stretched to nearly 14 hours. More disturbing were the sounds. Rodriguez and his team reported hearing what they described as muffled voices coming from inside the burning aircraft, conversations too distorted by the flames to understand, but unmistakably human in origin. The voices seemed to echo through the furnace vents, creating an eerie chorus that made several workers physically ill. When the cremation finally ended, investigators found something that defied explanation. Mixed in with the expected aluminum slag and ash were organic compounds that shouldn't have existed. Chemical analysis revealed traces of human DNA in the molten remains, despite the fact that no human beings had been inside the aircraft during its destruction. The DNA samples were too degraded to identify specific individuals, but their presence was undeniable. The disposal facility's management immediately classified the incident as confidential, citing client privacy and insurance concerns. All workers involved were required to sign expanded non-disclosure agreements, and the security footage from that evening mysteriously disappeared from the server. Chen was placed on indefinite medical leave and later transferred to a desk job in the company's Phoenix office. But the story doesn't end there. 3 months after the cremation of Flight 774, Chen received a phone call that changed everything. The caller identified himself as James Morrison, a passenger who had been seated in row 23 during the aircraft's emergency landing in Denver. Morrison claimed he had been experiencing vivid dreams about being trapped in a burning airplane, dreams that started the exact night 774 was destroyed. Morrison wasn't the only one. Over the following weeks, Chen was contacted by 17 other former passengers, all reporting similar nightmares that began on October 13th. They described dreams of walking through flames, of trying to find exits that didn't exist, of being surrounded by an unbearable heat that never seemed to burn them. Several mentioned seeing a technician watching them from behind glass, a man who looked exactly like Chen's photographs in news articles about aircraft safety. The dreams followed a disturbing pattern. Former passengers reported that their nightmares always began with the sound of engines starting, followed by the sensation of movement despite being surrounded by fire. They walked through the burning cabins searching for other passengers, gathering in groups near the emergency exits, waiting for evacuation instructions that never came. The dreams always ended the same way, with the dreamers turning toward a window and seeing someone watching them, someone who would suddenly collapse in terror. Chen began documenting these reports, creating a detailed log of each passenger's experience. What he discovered shook him to his core. The former passengers weren't just having random nightmares. They were experiencing the cremation from the inside, reliving the destruction of their former aircraft as if their souls had remained trapped within its aluminum walls. Dr. Sarah Martinez, a sleep specialist who treated several of the affected passengers, noted unusual brain activity patterns during their nightmares. EEG readings showed synchronized theta waves among unrelated patients, suggesting some form of shared consciousness experience. When she learned that all the patients had been passengers on the same flight, she began investigating the connection between their dreams and the aircraft's destruction. Martinez's research revealed that the nightmares intensified during times when other aircraft from the same fleet were being cremated. It was as if the destruction of similar aircraft triggered stronger connections to whatever force had bound the passengers to 774. Her findings were published in an obscure journal of paranormal psychology, where they were largely ignored by mainstream science. Meanwhile, Chen continued his own investigation. He discovered that 774 had experienced unusual phenomena throughout its service life, including multiple reports of electrical systems activating without human input, unexplained temperature fluctuations in the cabin, and passenger complaints of feeling watched by unseen presences. The aircraft had undergone 13 emergency inspections in its final 2 years of service, more than any other plane in the airline's fleet. The emergency landing in Denver had been precipitated by what investigators classified as simultaneous failure of multiple redundant systems, a statistical impossibility that suggested either sabotage or mechanical interference beyond current understanding. The flight crew reported that their instruments had displayed conflicting readings for nearly an hour before the landing, as if the aircraft was fighting their control inputs. Captain Rebecca Torres, who had piloted 774 during its final flight, agreed to meet with Chen 6 months after the cremation. She revealed details that hadn't appeared in any official reports, including her crew's observation that passengers seemed unusually calm during the emergency, almost as if they knew they would survive. Several flight attendants reported that passengers had thanked them for their service before the evacuation was even announced, behavior that defied normal human psychology during crisis situations. Torres also admitted something that had haunted her since the landing. As she performed her final walkthrough of the empty aircraft, she had felt compelled to announce "See you soon" over the intercom system, words that came from her mouth without conscious intent. She had never used that phrase before in her 22-year career and couldn't explain why she had felt compelled to say it. The cremation of Flight 774 had been scheduled for the same date that Torres had made her mysterious announcement, exactly 6 months to the day. Chen calculated that if Torres had somehow known the aircraft's destruction date, her parting words would have been prophetic. The passengers did see the aircraft again, in their dreams, on the night it burned. As Chen's investigation deepened, he uncovered similar incidents at aircraft disposal facilities worldwide. A Boeing 747 cremated in Frankfurt had reportedly shown shadows moving through its flames, witnessed by 3 separate technicians who all required medical treatment for shock. A decommissioned Airbus destroyed in Tokyo had emitted sounds described as human voices singing that were recorded by facility security systems before the files were confiscated by airline representatives. The pattern suggested that certain aircraft, particularly those involved in emergency landings where all souls survived, retained some form of connection to their former passengers. The cremation process, designed to reduce these mechanical objects to raw materials, instead triggered a supernatural reunion between the living passengers and their former aircraft. Chen's research led him to Dr. Elena Vasquez, a theoretical physicist specializing in consciousness studies at MIT. Vasquez had been investigating reports of mechanical objects displaying behavior consistent with retained memory or awareness. Her hypothesis suggested that under extreme conditions, human consciousness could imprint itself onto complex mechanical systems, particularly those involving life-or-death situations. According to Vasquez's theory, the passengers of Flight 774 had formed such a strong emotional bond with their aircraft during the emergency that their consciousness had become quantum entangled with its molecular structure. When the aircraft was destroyed, that connection manifested as shared dreams and phantom appearances, a form of technological haunting that challenged conventional understanding of both death and consciousness. The implications were staggering. If aircraft could retain imprints of human consciousness, what about other complex machines? Vasquez had documented similar phenomena involving automobiles that had been in fatal accidents, ships that had sunk with survivors, and even buildings that had been demolished after traumatic events. The cremation of Flight 774 might have been just one example of a much larger phenomenon. Chen's final report, submitted to the Federal Aviation Administration 8 months after the incident, was classified immediately upon receipt. His recommendations for investigating consciousness retention in decommissioned aircraft were rejected as outside the scope of mechanical safety protocols. The FAA issued a statement that the shadows observed during cremation were optical illusions caused by fuel combustion patterns, and that any correlation with passenger dreams was purely coincidental. But Chen knew better. He had seen those shadows move with purpose and intelligence through flames hot enough to melt aluminum. He had documented the testimonies of 17 former passengers whose dreams began the moment their former aircraft was destroyed. He had uncovered evidence of similar phenomena at disposal facilities around the world, all suppressed or explained away by industry authorities. The truth was that Flight 774 hadn't been destroyed that October evening. It had been transformed, its physical form reduced to slag and ash, while its spiritual essence dispersed into the dreams and memories of those who had once trusted it with their lives. The passengers weren't just dreaming about fire and evacuation. They were participating in the aircraft's final flight, a journey from the material world into something beyond human understanding. Today, Chen works as a quality control inspector at a small regional airport, far from the industrial crematoriums where aircraft go to die. But he still monitors reports of unusual phenomena at disposal facilities, collecting evidence for a truth he knows will never be officially acknowledged. The aviation industry depends on public confidence in mechanical reliability, and admitting that aircraft might retain consciousness would shatter that carefully maintained illusion. The former passengers of Flight 774 continue to experience their dreams, though less frequently as years pass. Some have reported that the dreams have evolved, showing them glimpses of other aircraft, other passengers, other emergency situations playing out in an endless cycle of mental death and spiritual transformation. They have become unwilling witnesses to an invisible network of consciousness that spans the entire aviation industry, a ghostly fleet of destroyed aircraft still carrying their phantom passengers through eternal skies of flame. Chen keeps a photograph on his desk from that October evening, a security camera still frame showing the observation booth where he collapsed. If you look closely at the reinforced glass window, you can make out a reflection, not of the burning aircraft outside, but of human faces pressed against the glass from the inside. Passengers looking out from their cremation pyres, searching for someone to acknowledge their presence in the space between life and final destruction. What would you do if you witnessed something that challenged everything you believed about life, death, and the machines we trust with our lives? Do you think this was merely hallucination and coincidence, or evidence that consciousness can survive in ways science hasn't yet discovered? Share your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe for more aviation investigations that reveal the hidden mysteries of flight that the industry doesn't want you to know.